Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, spectator sports.
I'm a journalist.
As the media crossed the finishing line at Beijing, just how well did they report China to the world? The war in Georgia. Journalists amongst the casualties. The silly season. What happens when the media put their feet up for the summer? And we've got just the thing to simplify an overly complicated world.
It's called the mainstream media.
Welcome back. Here at The Listening Post, the issue of freedom of speech and China has been a recurring theme. Whether it's restrictions on the internet, the jailing of bloggers, or the limitations put on journalists trying to report on the country. The Beijing Olympics were to be the litmus test of China's promise to open up to the news media. But what about the foreign media's own performance on the story? Would they report fairly on the world's biggest nation? Or did they go to Beijing with an agenda, an ideological axe to grind? That's our starting point this week. China, the Olympics, and the games people in the media play.
Opening day of the Olympics in Beijing was shadowed by troubles around the world and a tragic outburst of violence
to the biggest sporting event in the world, the Olympic Games. And China's critics are taking advantage of the attention Beijing is getting to get their message across.
It's very intense, and I think the media is looking for sort of problems to report on because Western media has an ulterior motive.
Today's big idea? Fake supporters.
Every time that a sporting commentator wants to say, this is fantastic, the games are brilliant, how well organised are they? There's like a little voice in their head saying, oh, you can't say something that's too positive about China, and so they kind of had to qualify it straight away.
It's set to be China's coming out party, but China's close ties with Sudan have become a black mark on the country's scorecard.
In China, there is a saying is, fighting birds in the egg, and that is what I would describe the situation. They're ignoring the overall picture.
Welcome to Beijing.
Long before the torch was lit in Athens and human rights protesters crashed the party, these were clearly going to be the political Olympics.
We have seen protesters trying to put out the flame with a fire extinguisher.
The torch relay and the protests along the way attracted huge media coverage. And when Beijing put on an opening ceremony unlike anything the world had ever seen, China's state-run media reported the story one way.
Politicians attending the big night were lavish with their praise.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
While Western media tended to have a different focus.
Where some scenes, illusions. Chinese officials explained some video of fireworks was pre-recorded and inserted into the live broadcast in case pollution obscured the view.
Another day, another lie by China's Politburo. Yesterday, the fake fireworks were exposed. Today, it seems, it's the bogus singing.
The 9-year-old girl who was seen singing as the Chinese flag entered the stadium was, in fact, lip-syncing.
Not since 1936, when they were held in Adolf Hitler's Germany, have a full Olympics been staged in a country that Western leaders and Western media view with such suspicion, even hostility. Moscow hosted the Games in 1980, but 62 countries, including the US and China, boycotted over the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. There is always a propaganda element to the Olympic Games, but the media haven't had an ideological gulf this wide to report on in more than 70 years.
The Olympics are not just about sport as much as many people would like to say they are. They're an opportunity for a country to present itself to the world. And of course, China, this is a very important time in China's history and in the world's history to watch an emerging great power. And therefore, I think there is a great amount of international attention to these games.
The Western media basically has this very fundamental distrust of anything the Chinese government says. And also, the Western media thinks that the Chinese government is using these Olympic Games as a sort of major propaganda tool to try to get across messages that the government wants to get across. And then the media thinks it's their job to then challenge that, to expose the lies.
The media has been negative with China. It's no surprise whether they would pick on the Olympic. It's just like anything we do from pre-Olympic, they've been picked on. So they're not getting much worse than I expected, but just the average tone is unfriendly.
Two reports in particular seem to have stood out for me. One was by ITN's Tim Ewan. The rest of the press were very excited about seeing all these new venues and just how fantastic the games were going to be. Tim Hewitt seems to be out there looking for a particular story. One of his stories went on about how Beijing had introduced a 2 a.m. curfew on bars and how it had CCTV everywhere.
But security here is paramount.
Now, this is a reporter based in London where bars shut much earlier than that usually, and where CCTV is more prevalent here than any other part of the world. So it was a little bizarre kind of report.
Tim Hewitt, ITV News, Beijing.
And the other one that got a lot of attention was Alex Thompson's press conference performance. It seemed to be a very personal performance of him haranguing both the IOC and the Chinese representatives over their human rights record and kind of basically refusing to sit down and shut up.
Well, Giselle, we're not getting anywhere, are we? Let's try that once more time. Is the IOC embarrassed about the Chinese government's not keeping promises on both press freedom and human rights? One more chance.
Well, I think probably your colleagues in the room would like to have a chance at questions as well. I think I've answered your question. Thank you.
China has much to answer for on human rights. It promised Western news organizations that its media reforms put in place especially for the Games would allow them to cover the story. Then security guards roughed up foreign journalists for trying to cover a Tibet protest.
Are you arresting me? I want to talk. I want to talk. I'm a journalist.
But what matters more than a foreign reporter's freedom to cover these games is the question of whether the reforms will last beyond the competition. Whether, for example, China will continue to allow access to some internet websites that it usually blocks.
Well, I must say, I mean, it's only a partial unblocking. There are, in fact, when I went to Amnesty International today, I could see the front page, but when I tried to click on reports about China, they were not available. I think it is a very small gesture that China has not met its promise of a free internet and free media during the Olympics.
I hope that the unblocking will stay, because I don't think the government has a lot to worry about these websites. And actually, when these sites were unblocked, many Chinese people, instead of supporting those views expressed at the website, they actually are very critical.
It's more open now, certainly. Once you unblock those sites, well, even if you block it again, but people already saw the outside world. So I think the government, if it is a clever government, will knowing going back it doesn't do any good. So overall, the trend is more and more open.
And that issue, whether China's new media freedoms will outlive the Games, is one news story that isn't going away.
I do think that is a serious issue as we go forward after the Olympics. When China makes a promise to the world, what does it mean? We really need to take this into consideration in terms of how we approach Chinese information out of China, and dealings with China and getting it into international agreements that promote freedom of speech and free media.
Here's how our Global Village Voices saw the media coverage of China during the Olympics.
Of course the media have agenda when it comes to covering the Beijing Olympics. Firstly, they've seized upon the idea of bad pollution. Now, that's an easy one to sell, you see, because, as we all know, the eco-movement is a wonderful, easy thing to get past editors these days. And ever since then, everyone's pretty much done a story on the bad pollution in Beijing. As do the other stories, well, we don't hear much of them, do we? Things like people being evicted. I would have seen about maybe 1-2 stories on that. Some of the human rights abuses, the absence of water in Beijing, the need to pump it from far away. These things, which I think are far, far more serious, have not been covered, either because the media are too afraid to cover them, or, well, the sound bites aren't very good, so that's why they've been left alone. Sad but true. Yes, the agenda are there, but just not the best agenda in the world.
My impression is that they are not covering this event in a balanced way. I would not use the word or biased, but certainly they are not covering it in a balanced way. My conclusion is that they have over-politicized this event. They have done it quite a lot. And my understanding that they do not appear to do it for the well-being of ordinary Chinese people or for the human rights of Chinese people. They are doing that because they have found something in China they dislike.
Our Global Village Voice platform is your chance to tell us what you think of the news media. If you have a webcam, cell phone camera, or even a digital camera, just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get your voice on the air. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The fighting in Georgia has taken its toll on journalists. Reporters Without Borders, the media rights group, says that at least 3 journalists have been killed there, 2 Russian reporters and a Dutch TV cameraman. Many more reporters have been wounded or held by the militaries involved. This Turkish news crew from the NTV network came under fire while traveling to cover the story. One of the men suffered a head wound. Tamara Urashadze, a correspondent with state-owned Georgian Public Broadcasting, was wounded live on the air when her arm was grazed by apparent sniper fire. She continued to report after taking cover in her crew's vehicle. Media outlets have been ransacked. Russian troops have been accused by Georgian journalists of shutting down local radio and television stations and destroying broadcasting equipment. The Reuters news agency and the Foreign Press Association in Jerusalem have both taken issue with a recent Israeli military investigation that has cleared Israeli soldiers for the killing of a cameraman in the Gaza Strip. Reuters photographer Fadal Shana was killed by a tank shell in April while he was filming the tank. The Israelis say the incident occurred at a time of heavy fighting and that Shana's camera could easily have been mistaken for an anti-tank missile launcher. Reuters, which says it conducted its own investigation, argued that clearing the soldiers involved effectively, quote, condones the disproportionate use of deadly force, unquote, by the Israeli army. The Foreign Press Association says it fears the Army's report will, quote, give soldiers free license to fire, greatly hindering the media's ability to cover the conflict. Washington is taking steps to stop Hezbollah's TV channel, Al-Manar, broadcasting across Southeast Asia and into the world's most populous Muslim country, Indonesia. Al-Manar has rented space on an Indonesian satellite, which beams the Lebanon-based channel signal into Southeast Asia, China, and Australia. The U.S. government, which has branded Hezbollah a terrorist organization and says that Al-Manar incites violence and hatred, has expressed its concerns to the Indonesian government. However, Indonesia's communications minister says Washington has no right to intervene in Indonesia's affairs. Earlier this year, a Thai satellite company says it stopped airing Al-Manar broadcasts after it was informed of the channel's ties to Hezbollah. There's a new piece of legislation before the U.S. Congress that would overturn the Bush administration's controversial ban on the publication of photos of fallen American soldiers. The legislation is called the Fallen Hero Commemoration Act and was introduced by a Republican congressman from North Carolina. Photographs of flag-draped coffins returning to the U.S. were allowed during the Vietnam era. However, since the start of the war in Afghanistan and then Iraq, the Pentagon has banned them from being published or broadcast. The Bush administration says the ban is in place out of respect for the victims' families. Critics of the policy say the American government is simply trying to keep bad news about the so-called war on terror out of the media. After the break, the media go on holiday, but war, famine, and natural disaster do not.